Hello, and welcome to the reaction rate and equilibrium video. Let's begin by talking about rates of reaction. Something that's very important for you to know is that chemical reactions require collisions between reactant molecules. So for a reaction to occur, our reactant molecules literally have to smash into each other. And they need to smash into each other with sufficient energy to break bonds. So if the collision doesn't have enough energy, then no reaction can occur. In addition to that, we need them to collide with the proper orientations. We need both enough energy to break bonds and the right angle of collision in order for a reaction to occur. And these collisions that result in a reaction are known as effective collisions. And these are usually just a small percentage of collisions. So more on that in a moment here. And I want to point out the study of reaction rate is also commonly called kinetics. So looking at our collisions here, if our molecules don't have sufficient energy and they crash into each other, they just bounce off each other and no reaction occurs. So that's one way that our collision might not result in reaction. The other way is if we have the wrong angle. So if our energy is too low and or our angle of collision is improper, then the molecules just bounce off each other and no reaction occurs. And it mentions here that only a very small percent of collisions are effective. So we're talking very small percent. We're talking much, much, much less than 1%. Usually the vast majority of these collisions between reactant molecules do not actually result in reaction. So we mentioned that there's energy required to break bonds. And we refer to this energy required to break bonds as the activation energy. And so here's our diagram. We start out with some reactants here, and then we need a certain amount of energy in order to cause the bonds to break and the reaction to occur. And the energy required to break these bonds, or this activation energy, is actually related to the strength of the bonds in the reactants. In this particular reaction, you can probably tell from the diagram, we have a relatively high activation energy, meaning our reactants have strong bonds and it's difficult to break those bonds. And you can actually kind of figure this out from the dot structure for N2 has a triple bond, which is very strong, and so that's why this collision requires so much energy to break those bonds. But sometimes we have reactants with weak bonds, and we might have a much smaller activation energy if we have those weak bonds. And so this is going to affect the chance that our collision is going to have enough energy to break the bonds. The higher the activation energy, the lower the chance that we'll have enough energy to actually break those bonds. And the smaller this energy, the greater the likelihood that our collision will smash apart the bonds. So anything that affects our collisions is actually going to affect our rate of reaction. So one thing that we see is if we want to speed up our reaction, we can use a greater concentration of reactants. So if our concentration is higher, there's more particles sort of crammed together, and that means that those more particles crammed together are going to result in more collisions at a faster rate. So again, the closer together our particles, either by compressing them or increasing the concentration, the more collisions we have and the faster the rate will be. Another way to increase our rate of reaction is to increase the temperature. The higher the temperature, the faster our motion of particles, and this actually is going to influence our reaction rate in two different ways. Not only are we going to have more collisions per second, so we have more collisions because we're zooming around faster, but we're also going to have higher energy collisions that are more likely to break the bonds. So again, temperature is very important. Higher temperature means more collisions per second and a higher probability that each collision will actually smash those bonds apart. And then finally, a catalyst is going to increase the rate of reaction by lowering the activation energy. And so one would think this wouldn't be that important, but actually it has a huge effect on the rate of reaction. We can increase the rate of reaction by millions or billions of times. And the reason for that is ordinarily the probability that our collision is going to be effective is so small that our reaction goes slowly. But if we can increase that chance that our collision is going to be effective, then our rate is going to get dramatically faster. Again, like millions or billions of times faster. So how do catalysts work? Well, they're actually going to speed up the rate of the reaction by lowering the activation energy. And so the way they do that is they actually stick to our reactant molecules kind of temporarily, and they weaken the bonds. And by weakening those bonds, they're more likely to break. So again, they stick to our reactant molecules, they make the bonds more likely to break, and they're not used up during the reaction. And catalysts are known as enzymes in biology. So you've probably heard that term enzyme before. Enzymes are what we call catalysts in biology. And so organisms are really reliant on these because it's going to allow the organism to have relatively fast reaction rates. And that's going to, allow it to run fast or swim fast or do whatever it needs to do quickly. And so here's a diagram right here. So without the catalyst, our reaction has a relatively high activation energy, so our chances of there being an effective collision are relatively low. So if we add a catalyst, then suddenly we have a new lower activation energy because our bonds are weaker, and each collision is far more likely to be effective, and therefore our reaction rate is going to be dramatically increased. So I'd like you to pause the video and then please complete questions 1 through 3 in the activity. Alright, welcome back. So now we're going to switch topics and we are going to talk about reversible reactions. So reversible reactions are reactions that are going to proceed in both the forward and reverse directions. You might not be really familiar with these, but we look at some chemical reactions, like for instance if we take a piece of paper, we light that paper on fire, we end up with carbon dioxide, water, some ashes. But you never see carbon dioxide, water, and ashes deburn themselves. You never see them go in the reverse direction. So some reactions only go in one direction. Combustion is a great example of that. Other reactions can go in both directions. And so an example you might be familiar with from biochemistry would be the bonding of oxygen to hemoglobin. So in our arteries, we have, where they pass through the lungs, the oxygen and the hemoglobin sort of bind together, and then later they unbind to each other, and that's how the oxygen is released into our body. So there's actually a lot of reversible reactions in biology. In addition to the hemoglobin one, the attachment and detachment of phosphate to make ATP or ADP, you may be familiar with that one also, or you may not. That's fine if you haven't heard of that one. That's another reversible reaction. And so this tends to happen when our products and reactants are relatively similar in stability or potential energy. And if we have a reversible reaction, then people tend to use these two-direction arrows to indicate the reaction proceeds in both the forward and reverse direction. So what we're trying to illustrate here is that our SO2s and our O2s react to form SO3, but SO3s are also at the same time breaking back down into SO2 and O2. So a reaction never quite reaches completion because as we go in the forward direction, we also partially cancel it out by going in the reverse direction. So if we leave any reversible reaction sitting long enough, it's going to reach this state that's known as equilibrium. And so equilibrium is where the forward rate becomes equal to the rate in the reverse direction. So again, if we leave this reaction sitting long enough, our rate in the forward direction is going to decrease over time. And the reason for that is that essentially we're using up our reactants, and so as that concentration goes down, we have fewer collisions between those particles, and our rate in the forward direction is going to go down. However, as we make more product, this product's actually the reactant in the reverse direction, our rate in the reverse direction is going to speed up. But eventually we're going to reach this point where the rates in the forward and the reverse directions are going to be equal to each other. So our reaction doesn't stop. Just what happens is that our concentrations stop changing. So that's what I mean by the nothing changes here. Our concentrations stop changing because our rate in each direction cancels each other out. And so again, it's going to appear that the reaction's stopped, but what's actually happened is the rate in each direction is canceling each other out. So one of the things you'll be asked to do in this chapter is write equilibrium expressions. And that's the ratios, like the type of thing we see right here. So the way we write these, we use these 3 steps. Solids and liquids are omitted from the expression. Gases and aqueous materials are included. And so, how do you know what's what? Well, you just look at the states in the equation. The states in the equation will tell you. So G and AQ, you're going to include in your equilibrium expression. Solids and liquids, so S and L, you'll exclude. So in our first reaction here, I should just finish up these steps here. The products are listed over the reactants in the ratio, and the coefficients from the balanced equation become exponents. So here we have all gases, so nothing's left out of our expression, and our coefficients become exponents, so we have 2 of our NCl3s, so that's where this 2 right here goes, and 3 of these Cl2s, and that's going to go right there. And that's that. So solids and liquids left out, products of reactants, coefficients become exponents. And this one right here, we have a solid, solid, gas, gas. So the solids are left out of the expression. Products go over reactants. In this case, all our coefficients are 1, so we don't need to put any exponents in our equation here. And so here's our equilibrium expression for the second reaction. So if you follow these 3 steps, you should always get the right equilibrium expression. Alright, so you saw in that equilibrium expression we set that ratio equal to K. And K is what's known as the equilibrium constant. And so if our reaction has a large equilibrium constant, what that means is that at equilibrium we'll have more products than reactants. So again, a big K value, K that's much larger than 1, means that we have a lot more products than reactants. Now if our K is equal to 1, that means that our numerator and our denominator in our ratio are about the same. So that means we have equal amounts of products and reactants, more or less. And then also we can have a small value of K. If we have a small value of K, that means we have a lot more reactants than products. So although the rate in the forward direction and the reverse direction are the same, they're equal to each other, the rates, the concentrations are rarely equal to each other. So usually we're going to have more products at equilibrium, which is going to mean we're going to have a large value of K. And this might be in scientific notation, it might be very large. Or we're going to have a small value of K indicating that we have a lot more reactants than products at equilibrium. And so this might be a decimal number or something with a negative exponent, like in scientific notation. So these will never be negative numbers, but you might see negative exponents for these. So please end the video here and complete questions 4 through 6, and then we'll move on and wrap up the video in part 2.